Welcome to Spirit's Journey, coming to you live on Truth Frequency Radio and simulcast on Oneness Talk Radio. Your hosts are Patrick and Catherine Andrews.
Join us each week as we explore a wide range of metaphysical topics such as dreams, astrology, intuitive readings, and life purpose. You'll receive practical guidance so that you can live your most awesome life.
Learn more about what we do at intuitiveschool.com and connect with us on Facebook at Spirit's Journey Radio. Welcome to Spirit's Journey. We are coming to you on Truth Frequency Radio and simulcast on Oneness Talk Radio, among others. You can also find us on iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and TalkStream Live. We're here in the Heartland, holding the energy for spiritual truth and awareness. I'm Patrick.
And I'm Catherine. Welcome, everyone.
Today we have a special guest, Ron Chapman. And Ron, by his own admission, is hard to classify. He's firmly on a spiritual path with practices and teachings that continue to evolve, yet he's written books about a real-life serial killer and a goat named Wonder on a spiritual quest, as well as a book about spiritual contemplations and an audio set called The Way of the Spirit. So on top of all that, he does breath work. He has an audio set doing breath work. He has a program, a book, a website for those in 12-step recovery, and his core practice website, seeingtrue.com. So just for good measure, in the world, he is a strategist, a facilitator, and leadership consultant and coach for public health, which includes a large practice portfolio at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, where he lives. So welcome, Ron.
Thanks, Patrick, Catherine. Glad to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
Oh, you are most welcome. Looking forward to it. You have such an eclectic background and a lot of interest. And so I really love having that kind of broad spectrum to kind of pull from. So this is going to be quite interesting.
And
yes.
And fun to see where we go.
Definitely.
Well, I can totally relate, Ron, because Patrick and I also have such an array of things that we do. You know, we just can't get it narrow. It's like, yeah, but this is interesting and that, and I want to write this book, and on and on and on. But one of the core things of what you do is Seeing True, which is the name of your website. And so let's start there. What is the Seeing True practice?
Yeah, in short, I mean, I can go highfalutin on this and talk about metanoia, the Greek notion of when we really take something fully into our heart, into our being, it radically changes us. I mean, history is littered with these stories of transformations. And so one of the things I've been working with pretty much across all this eclectic package is practices and approaches and ways of helping people see in an entirely different way that can change everything, whether that's in an organizational setting, like I do a lot of that strategist work, or a lot of the one-on-one work I do. And it invigorates me to see ways to help people break through where they're stuck.
So is this related to perception? You know, we've all heard the story about, you know, there's a car accident, 10 people saw it, but everybody saw something different. Does it have to do with correcting people's perception, or how would you compare perception to true seeing?
Ooh, that's like the perfect question, Catherine. It's about our translator. Each of you and me and everybody else, we have this unique way of seeing the world. And it's based on our own genetics, our own histories, our own experiences, our own traumas. And so the result of that is that we have to think about how we translate reality into our understanding with all our biases and preconceived notions and blind spots and shadow selves. And so it's that space that we explore, is how do we see this world and understand the way we are seeing? Because once you understand the translator, it changes everything.
Now, Ron, even though that concept sounds very familiar according to a lot of spiritual practices and disciplines that I've studied before and that I've used myself, so what kind of spiritual influences and practice actually go into this? Anything that we might recognize?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Let me say this first, Patrick, and I'm glad you asked that. I'm glad you asked about that. You know, one of the problems that one of my mentors, a guy who worked with me for 28 years, said that we get locked into a modality and think that the modality is the solution. We believe in, I don't know, mediums, or we believe in acupuncture, or we believe in depth psychology. And what he taught me was that each and every one of us can find an entirely different modality which can be effective for us, and that can change over time. So I have drawn from everything from the 12-step recovery world, which is where I had my first epiphanies. I can draw readily from the work of Joel Goldsmith, The Infinite Way, who some of your listeners undoubtedly have heard of.
Excellent book.
Oh man, he had some perceptions that were remarkable.
And series, actually, I've read that whole series.
Yeah, he was
insights.
He was prolific. Died in 1950 something, as I recall. Course in Miracles has been a source. Gurdjieff, the Armenian spiritualist, has been a source. Going back to Catherine's use of the word eclectic, what I was taught to do was to pick out things that I could use effectively with particular audiences, and then use them with those audiences to adapt my practice to the audience, not to try to get the audience to understand my practice. And so things like, stolen from the business world, root cause analysis, which I can use in organizational settings, is language they can get their head around. And the reason to do that is because, and Goldsmith said this, other teachers have said this, you'll have far more luck trying to work within people's ways of understanding than trying to teach them new ways of understanding. So that's kind of the approach.
Cool. So now you mentioned the 12-step program, and I haven't done that myself, but I've encountered a lot of people who have done it. And it seems like quite a few people have come from the 12-step programs into spirituality. So why is that? Why do so many people make that shift or that connection from 12-step to a spiritual path or some kind of spiritual practice?
One of the things that the 12-step programs, and in my case, I know this is the thing people tread lightly around. I'm 34 years sober, so that's kind of how I got at this. But one of the things that 12 steps basically says is, in short, that unless you find access to some power greater than yourself, you'll be hard pressed to fix yourself. And then they do the remarkable thing of saying, and what you want to believe about that is none of our business. So if you want to be a Buddhist, be a Buddhist. If you want to be a Christian, be a Christian. If you're born a Jew and want to practice Judaism, great. You want to be a crystallist, be a crystallist. They are, funny enough, they're agnostic about how one finds this power, but they're very insistent that you must find it. So there's all these offshoots into just about every kind of spirituality, because people find that, in short, that is what they're going to have to find in order to have their lives remade.
Interesting.
So, Ron, with the, you yourself are a recovering alcoholic, I understand. And what I would love to explore is, the cause of the drinking, because I know some people also who have gone, through the 12-step program, recovering alcoholics. Do you think it's to avoid somebody that I know described it to me as the alcohol allowed her to avoid the pain? So is it just a different form of escape from, it could be pain in the current lifetime, it could be pain brought over from past lives. What's at the root of the desire to escape?
So this is like one of those great unknown spaces, Catherine. There is generally large agreement that there's a genetic component, and that the genetic component is really about how substances are processed in the body. That you can take people who have this genetic predisposition, and if exposed, there's a likelihood that they will lose the ability of choosing alcohol or drugs or any number of other, I'm sure you all run into this all the time. I mean, addiction just runs the gamut. What seems to drive that, though, is, and the language that comes from the recovery rooms is restless, irritable, and discontented, is that we are experiencing dis-ease, discomfort. And the result is we're looking for something to take the edge off of that discomfort. And so in that sense, you're exactly right, Catherine, that we're trying to avoid these pains, these traumas, these difficulties. In recent years, there has been a growing body of evidence that a lot of this has to do with traumas, childhood traumas especially. which produce adaptations in the body and the psyche. And the result of that is that there's a higher predisposition to needing substances. Now, one of the funny things about it, and I would be remiss if I didn't say this, is when you talk to recovering people, regardless of the substance, it's not uncommon for them to say that the substance saved their life because they would not have been able to stay alive, typically suicide, without some relief. And then when the substance stops serving them sufficiently, they're left to figure out how to deal with all of that unfinished business without the substance. Hence the recovery programs and all the modalities that we're now seeing come together in the world to help us get past addiction.
Oh, wow. Well, now also the same friend that was telling me that, she drank to escape the pain. She actually told me something fascinating, which I did not know, that I think it's something like 98% of people that go through recovery, it doesn't work. They go back to drinking. And so she actually, devised a system using breath work and different alternative techniques to help her recover because she found the traditional method wasn't enough. So I wonder what you would say to that, and if you have devised anything beyond the 12-step program to help people get better.
Yeah, here I'm back to the earlier question about the various things I have drawn from. And I'm going to be really honest. There's nothing virtuous in my arrival at all these different practices. Essentially, what one learns if one is honest with oneself is you get hammered into submission and then you try other things. That seems to be true for lots of us.
Yeah,
so
I can relate.
It's like, it's like, man, we just want to make something work and it just won't. So I have found, as a result of some work that was done on my own childhood trauma, breath work is something I have found to be essential, at a minimum, to keep people present and at best to promote healing. My own experience and my experience with lots of other people resulted in a program, Progressive Recovery. I've written a book, there's a curriculum soon to be out, which takes the familiar space that 12-step people know and expands upon the use of those 12 steps in some pretty significant ways. I recently several years ago, a guy I had worked with in recovery for a long, long time with just a terrible trauma history. We eventually decided that he had to go try ayahuasca. And I don't talk easily about those things because a lot of people in recovery think that any mind-altering substance is bad news. But in his case, he had tried so much else, and we had read so much about it that he tried ayahuasca, and it seems to have solved this long-standing trauma for him. There are so many things being brought to substance abuse recovery at this point, Catherine, that I think I'd be a fool to suggest. Well, I guess I should say this. There's a lot of charlatans out there too. And so I'm aware that, what is it, P.T. Barnum said something along the lines of, there will always be room for another sucker. It's like, so that's out there too, and I guess we just need time and practice to know what really seems to work for others.
Well, it's really interesting because this kind of theme that we started with here is that your eclectic background, and so the lesson here could be that there isn't just any one size fits all solution. And, I think it was about 20 years ago now, I saw this study. It was in an article, and they were looking at how people identified with their religion at the time. Mm-hmm. And they were commenting that the research was showing that fewer and fewer people were identifying as one specific religion, mm-hmm. as, Christian or Buddhist or Muslim or anything like that. So they found that more and more people, even at that time, were starting to identify as Jewish Christians or, Buddhist Christians or, Buddhist Wiccans or different things like that. Like people were right. eclectically reaching for all these different spiritual practices to try to find that mix, which really resonated with them. So can you mm-hmm. relate to that, or do you see that?
Yeah. One of my peers, a guy who's had his own interesting eclectic path, he and I were talking about this. He has studied ancient Tibetan Buddhism at some length. And what he told me held up. At one point, he said, there's an old, deep Tibetan adage that says, in the end, you're going to have to plow your own furrow. And that's not actually an agricultural reference. It's a spiritual reference that says that in the end, the path to what some would call enlightenment or awakening or peace or whatever we want to call it, ultimately has to become your own unique size. And that doesn't mean, I'm just going to use the two of you, Patrick, that doesn't mean you can't learn from Catherine's practice and she can't learn from yours and you all can't learn from mine. It means that in the end, there has to be a Patrick-sized path and a Catherine-sized path and a Ron-sized path, and that all of them are true paths for each of us. The mistake would be in thinking that I must cohere to yours, either one of you, or that you must cohere to mine. Now, the problem is that runs smack into organized anything, where so somebody somewhere is going to tell you there's one right way. And I would say the evidence suggests that doesn't hold up very well.
Well, yeah, that's actually something that Patrick and I agreed to long ago when we formed our school, that, we were not going to be trying to coerce people into our way of doing things, that we really recognized each individual has their own path, and that we were only going to offer our services as a guide to help people find their unique path rather than trying to get them to follow our path, which I think you're right. That is the problem with a lot of the organized religions, which is probably why a lot of them are, losing big numbers, because, it's not broad enough for everybody to be able to follow their own path and still be in this type of group or organization.
Yeah, I'm so appreciative that that's what you all are doing too, for the same reasons that I do it. Now, what's so hard about it though, Catherine, is, each of us finds something that works for us, at least for a time. Ram Dass said, every path must ultimately be abandoned, for it cannot take us where we need to go. So even what works for me right now has a time limit on it. And so the ego problem we have is we do something that works, and what we want to do is we want to shout it from the highest mountaintop and tell everybody to do what we did, so that it's very, very egotistical, so that they can realize the benefits we've realized. There's some humility that has to come with that says, maybe it won't work for them. That doesn't mean there's something wrong with my approach. It means it's not sized for them. And in the best of all worlds, the longtime mentor I told you about, he said, so Ron, if you're committed to the idea of serving others, you're going to have to go find other things and learn how to work with them, with people, or at least how to point people to them. And that has proven to be really, really durable for my practices.
So Ron, what would you say is your core message? What is it that you are calling people to discover?
That wherever you are, if you are stuck, there is a way to get unstuck, and that we were designed to thrive. And if we're not thriving, that is perfect diagnostic feedback that tells us it's time to shake something up and try something different, which is the heart of what I would call all transformational work, is the recognition that we get stuck. It's built into the design of being a human on planet Earth. And what's not so common is getting unstuck. Mostly because we keep trying the same things and get increasingly frustrated because they don't work.
I can really relate to that. And that's how I've come to understand what Catherine and I do, and what we focus on is more, I would say, giving people tools to really reach inside and discover what it is that they want to express, what their mission is, and what their learning purpose is. And, when you talked about that, what we are doing will change over time. I've definitely seen that over the course of my life, that my spiritual practices have changed over time, depending on where I am and what I'm doing. And, I would say in general, like if I was going to distill it down, that over time that I'm working toward making my message more simple. When I was younger, I went into this great, broad, in-depth study of metaphysics and everything spiritual. And so now I'm working to just distill that down to its essence.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you if this fits, Patrick. What I hear you describing is that you have greater wisdom than once you had, right? That the process of life and the process of practice has refined your understanding. Does that seem fair enough?
Sure. I mean, I'm trying to be humble and not, claim to be this great sage, but the way I would describe it is, yeah, I have more experience now. And of
Yeah.
course, experience leads to wisdom. So
Yeah.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. I mean, that experience, it knocks off all those rough edges and opens I mean, if we're honest with ourselves, man, I actually have this experience. I have a particular relationship to humility. And the reason is because I routinely do stupid stuff. And what happens is that there's this, it's literally a visceral, it's a somatic sinking feeling in the pit of my belly. It just happened right now, just by telling you all that truth, that I do stupid stuff. It like knocks me off my own pedestal. And it's also true. And the result is that I get this deep somatic grounding. It's like, oh, right, Ron, don't get too attached to your PR reel.
Right.
Because great damage has been done, spiritual malpractice by all kinds of people, because they start getting too attached to their own PR and their own successes, and the next thing you know, they're doing stuff that none of us would want to do, but it sneaks up in the dark at night, right? So humility is a really central piece of this.
Oh, right. I mean, I think everybody, when they're being honest, has to admit that we've all made mistakes, and it's acknowledging that and learning from it is the most important thing. It's like, if you learn from the mistake and you've changed your way of thinking so that you are different as you move forward, then you've really benefited from that. And that all goes to our learning.
I'm sorry to step on what you were saying there,
No,
Patrick.
that's right.
I was just aware. I mean, have you ever gone to any event where there's someone you're going to see and have them tell you only that they did everything right, or that it was a walk through the tulip patch? I mean, no. I mean, we want to hear how people, how they stumbled and fell and messed up, and how they were damaged by life, and what they've done to move past that. I mean, that's the authentic story that everyone seems to be called to, because I mean, it's our story, right? I mean, we all keep stumbling.
Sure. I mean, I think that's the most powerful form of teaching, is what you're talking about, that inner authority. But I've also seen it the other way, like what you're talking about, where a spiritual teacher is afraid to admit that they make mistakes. And there's this sense like, oh, if I show my mistakes, then my students won't respect me anymore or follow me anymore. And yet, you're sitting there watching them make mistakes. It's obvious they're making mistakes. And so it's always been difficult for me to really be able to, fully respect what they're doing when they're not able to admit, the mistakes that they've made, like you were saying. And, it's a really good teaching moment to just say, look, I really screwed up. This is what I did. This is what happened. This was what I was thinking that led to that. This is what I did to get out of it. This is what I did to make amends. All those parts of the journey, I think, are really important and provide a really powerful lesson, I think, for people who are kind of trying to follow in their footsteps.
Boy, that just reminded me of one of my big lessons. I've done a lot of platform work. I'm an internationally accredited speaker, and so I some highfalutin stuff there, which I say with a bit of chagrin. But I was doing this speech in front of about 500, presentation in front of about 500 people, and I was so good that day. I mean, I was on it, which sometimes happens. And somehow or another, at the end, I realized that I was leaving the wrong impression, that people thought I was some kind of wonder kid. And so I closed it by telling people that they were misperceiving me, that they thought that I was some prodigy. And in fact, and then I told them the story of losing everything when I had to get sober, and how awful and almost killed me. And what happened afterwards was people came up and talked to me, and I realized that by telling them the truth about me, I made me real. And that what one guy told me, which just almost broke my heart, he said, so what I got from that, Ron, was that if you can do that, so can I. And that had not been their perception until I got real with them. that I was some kind of prodigy and that it wouldn't work for them. So, man, it was a humbling lesson that my leading with my greatest foibles was actually really valuable to any given audience or any given client or patient.
Well, yeah, I think that's the irony is that the more that you show your faults and your humanness, the more that you actually connect with people. And we think in our mind it's going to be different, right? If we portray ourselves and show our greatness, we're going to connect, but not really. And if we look at the Bible, it's like the more that people see the humanness in Jesus, I think the more that we can relate to his story, and which is why I think he's one of the more relatable people or in history, because he was human after all. So anyway, we are coming up on the break, right, Patrick?
Yeah.
That's right. So Ron, real quick before the break, how can people get a hold of you or check you out if they're wanting to find out something about you over the break?
Well, I have a core site, ronaldchapman.com, which sort of branches off into everything. But if they want to go look at the content, they can just go to seeingtrue.com.
All right. Excellent. So we are at the bottom of the hour, which means we're going to be going into a short 3-minute break. While we are on break, you can go to our Spirits Journey page on tfrlive.com. You can sign up to support the station because TFR is a listener-supported station. You can also check out what we do at intuitiveschool.com. This is Spirits Journey on Truth Frequency Radio, also being simulcast on Oneness Talk Radio, among others. And we will see you on the other side. We are back from the break. If you're just joining us, this is Spirit's Journey with Patrick and Catherine Andrews, coming to you on Truth Frequency Radio and Oneness Talk Radio. We are here today with Ron Chapman. So welcome back, Ron. Very interesting discussion we're having here. Very eclectic background, which I can totally relate to. So you have the book, The Way of the Spirit. And so we heard that you're working on a new one, The Way of Stillness. So can you kind of give us a little bit of a preview of what that is and how it relates?
Sure. The Way of Spirit, which is comes through Ozark Mountain Publishing. When I was deep trying to figure a lot of this stuff out, it was in-depth work. And I finally came up with a way of understanding, a way of thinking about how spirit works, which is a lot like the Tao, the idea that there's a flow or a current, and when you understand the nature of the current, you can work with or against or cooperate with the flow. So that held up really well for quite a while, and it's out in the world. But more recently, I've been using, this is being recorded in the time of the pandemic. That's just the COVID pandemic. That's just for future listeners. But I was supposed to go on a pilgrimage to Scotland, actually, to Iona, and the plug got pulled on it. And I decided, somebody told me, it's like, well, pilgrimage is an inside journey. It's not an outside journey anyway. So I'm actually on day 115 of my COVID-enforced inner pilgrimage. And what has come out of that is what I think will become the next body of work, which is The Way of Stillness. And at this point, I guess all I can say about it is that what's been shown to me, and I could have never, you never know this stuff is coming, is that when Jesus said the kingdom of heaven was within you, he was telling us the truth, that everything is manifest out of the withinness. And what I seem to be being shown is a way of exploring that, I guess is the right way to say it. And so I've been keeping a bunch of notes, and at least for now, it's called The Way of Stillness. And it's something that when we were talking earlier about how new things are revealed or new things come to us, I could have never predicted the stuff that I seem to be being taught right now. So that'll probably be about an audio set sometime probably in 2021, I suspect, if things go according to any plan that actually turns out to hold up.
So you're talking about The Way of Stillness, and that reminds me a lot of breathwork. Catherine and I can definitely relate to doing breath work. So does breath work tie into that at all?
Yeah. Breath work is really interesting. You all work in that space. So you know that I don't know your modalities in breath work, but but there's a certain timelessness that comes with being with the breath. In fact, I remember when I was reading some of Eckhart Tolle's Power of Now, I realized he was describing for me the experience of what happens when I'm hanging in that breath space. And stillness is like that. It's an inner state. I've been practicing forms of meditation for many, many years. And it's that state that sometimes come to people with a meditation practice where there's actually nothing going on. You're just like hanging in the now, or hanging in the stillness of the moment. And it turns out, at least at this moment, it appears that in that stillness, all things are or can be manifest. All things are accessible. It's actually what Carl Jung was pointing to when he talked about the collective unconscious that is literally embedded in our psyche, so that it's all just waiting there for us. It's the same thing that people who do deep dream work, they talk about accessing that through dream work, regressive techniques and so forth. And so I just happen to be finding it in stillness. Does that jive with what you were thinking, Patrick, about breath work?
Well, yeah. I mean, it actually went beyond what I was immediately thinking about, because our background, we started out with Leonard Orr. He had brought Breathwork over here, and then Sandra Ray was an extension of that, and we worked with both of them. And so there was this point of stillness that they talk about where, it's that you reach that breathless state. And so whenever we do the breath work, you reach this point where the breathing just kind of takes over and you're on automatic pilot. And that's when you're really connecting to your intuitive self. So we would always like to call it intuitive breathing, where, some people might call it rebirthing and some people call it breath work, but we would often refer to it as intuitive breathing because it really connects you to that intuitive part of the mind, which is what I'm understanding, in a lot of what you're describing there, that you're connecting with that broader sense of self where we're all interconnected. And that's that realm where a lot of our work comes from, where, for example, we do the intuitive readings. And so we do past life and health readings. And so when you're talking about the regression work, where people are regressing either through this life or into past lives and things like that, all of that is there. So, we can definitely relate to that, but it also, I think, goes even beyond that with a lot of what you're describing there in terms of, accessing past lifetimes and things like that too.
Well, I like your language of intuitive breath work or intuitive work. One of my teachers said that it was her perception that one side of our brain is nothing but an intuition receptor that has access to all things. And the other side of the brain is the executor function, the human part that does stuff with stuff. So when you were just talking about the stillness and the intuition that awaits us there, that's the stillness space. And apparently the only way we can tap it is to we have to somehow or another quiet the part of us that's the executor that just wants to do stuff, so that intuition can have its way with us. So that's useful language for me. Thank you for that, Patrick.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. That seems to be a commonality, because all the different techniques that I've learned over the years, that seems to be the one thing that every technique is really driving at, is stilling the conscious mind. Because what I realize is the conscious mind is always just chattering. You've got all this busyness and it's just loud and it's drowning out all these intuitive insights. And so once you can get enough control of the conscious mind where you can cause it to be quiet and still, that's when those intuitive insights and that intuitive awareness comes through.
Well, and the other thing about breath work that I love personally is that it's not only, as we're talking, a very spiritual practice that gets us into the present moment, but the health benefits are incredible in terms of, I've studied a lot of natural health, and one of the core underlying causes of dis-ease is a lack of oxygen in the body. And so what does breath work do? It oxygenates you. And kind of interesting, the current policy to put a mask on everybody is actually decreasing our oxygen. So everybody needs to be doing breath work now, right?
That's a good point.
That's perfect.
Only the breath workers understand the dangers of wearing a mask when you're healthy. But Ron, you actually, speaking of health, you have gone into the realm of public health and actually shall I say the Centers for Damage Control? Oh, excuse me, Centers for Disease Control. Tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to tell you that it had been some well-conceived plan, but what it turned out was a lot of my facilitative practices and a lot of my strategy practices, things that I learned from a first career and some stuff that's just first nature for me, have great value in public health. And I think what is unfortunate is that the full scope of public health is not well understood and much maligned in many cases. In some cases, that's probably fair, but it runs the gamut from all that wonderful policy that now keeps us from being exposed to tobacco smoke. That's public health. To prevention of folate sensitive birth defects, because it turns out if mothers don't get enough folic acid in their diet, that they have a disproportionately high presence of birth defects. To yes, fluoridated water, which lots of people have opinions about that, but there's a whole lot of oral health that has been the byproduct of that. So it has proven to be a really fertile space for me. And the part I like most about public health is how I'm going to use a particular characterization of most public health people is how good-hearted they are. Or as I have sometime been known to say, it's nice to be affiliated with a field that really gives a damn about people. And so despite its foibles and challenges, they're focused on some things that I think matter a great deal in terms of health across populations, which is far, far different than my health or your health. It's like, how do we create an environment that supports good health is probably the larger question.
So have you had any contact with people who are interested in natural health practices and maybe some alternative health practices? Because that's something we've really found over the years. We get much more benefit out of holistic health practitioners and eating organic as much as possible and things like that. But it seems like there's almost like this, not that it's the public health community that is working against it, but there's this movement, really trying to push, all of these processed foods and, genetically modified foods and, foods that are just saturated with pesticides and even genetically enhanced so that they can saturate them more with pesticides and not kill the plants and things like that. So is that kind of in the scope of public health as
very much? Yeah. Yeah, there's a really, really rich body of work in public health about healthy food, about whole food. Nutrition is now understood to be central to most everything we care about in terms of health. No surprise, ultimately, but
right.
So public health does some. These are just some of the things I've been exposed to. Is like, how do we get more community gardens? How do we get more school-based gardens? And how do we get those kids to take that produce home with a recipe? Because they're very likely going home to a place that may not know how to cook those vegetables. So they have to go home with a recipe, and then they have to convince their moms to know what to do with these fresh vegetables. One of the biggest mitigators of a whole lot of disease states in all kinds of communities, especially communities that are what we would typically call low resource, is fresh food. And one of the killers is what are called food deserts, and public health is trying to eliminate that. Food deserts are where all there is a convenience store. So it's 10 miles to the nearest grocery store, and typically there's bad transportation and all that stuff. And so in the end, there's a big public health effort to get fresh food into the lives of people, especially in areas that have poor access to healthy food, because there's a real acknowledgement about how much healthy food matters. And it's a tough one to crack, because the reason there aren't grocery stores in those communities is because they're not communities that they feel like they can make enough money in. So the profit incentive can be a problem.
Well, yeah, because the catch-22 is that a lot of people in those communities that are experiencing these food deserts, those are people that would typically buy a lot of prepackaged and processed foods, and so the produce would spoil, right? So that's one reason why a lot of these bigger chains and stuff are saying, well, that's why we're not going in here, because it's like these aren't the kind of people that would eat our kind of fresh food and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, it's an educational problem too, and not just a supply issue.
It is a little bit of a chicken and an egg problem. I'm going to use a really typical example we've heard all the time about bad mommies, who just won't buy good food for their kids. Well, in order to really understand that problem, you have to understand that that's all. I mean, to your point, Patrick, that so-called bad mommy has no access to quality food unless they get on public transportation and go some distance and lug that stuff home. And then they're going to walk into a store where they're going to find some packaged product for a buck. And they're going to be confronted with that or some high quality food which is $5. And they're concerned about putting food in kids' bellies because hunger is a terrible thing. I've done a lot of work with food banks and have a lot of admiration for their work to combat hunger. And so everything in the system is built against mothers being able to do for their kids what they would do if we made it possible for them to do so. I'll share just one example, which was interesting to me at one point. I was in a food co-op, and I was really perplexed to find out that the apples that were literally grown 5 miles up the valley were 50% more expensive than commercial apples that had been flown in from New Zealand.
Yeah, I saw that too. When we were in Hawaii, I could not believe it. But the pineapple that was grown right there was the same price as the pineapple that we would get back home.
And what a friend and I were talking about that, about the systems costs, the systems burdens. This is sort of public health systems thinking. And the problem is that all the costs of putting those apples in New Zealand on a plane and flying it to the US, all of those costs are externalized. Everybody's paying to subsidize those cheap apples from New Zealand. And nobody is helping subsidize the apples on the trees 5 miles from the store.
That's crazy. Why is that?
Well, because we've built systems which make it inexpensive to move produce and products. And so we've made it cheap to stick stuff on a plane and fly it from New Zealand, at the same time that we have neglected the effective distribution of local produce. And so we refer that in public health as it's a systems problem, that unless you do something to give the same advantages to the local grower, they can't compete with the grower in New Zealand. And New Zealand makes fine apples. This is not about the apples, it's about the systems costs. So you can't actually solve these nutrition problems without dealing with the public health and distribution systems, which propagate essentially bad nutrition. And that's an area nobody wants to delve into because it's really complicated, and everybody wants to believe we can just tell people to eat better and that's going to solve the problem, except it doesn't work because the system doesn't support it.
Well, it seems like
especially because there's so much evidence about eating locally, that
Yes.
The bees, the honey in your local area is what your body needs. So we would be way better off eating the apple that grew down the street than one all the way over in New Zealand.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that, Catherine.
And it seems like part of it is a perception issue as well, because everybody wants that apple year round, even though obviously there's an apple season. So that means that you have to get apples from all over the world to make sure that there are always apples there on that produce shelf.
Or here's a really cool part, and this comes a little almost from your neck of the woods, at least the neck of the woods we both share. There's an apple called an Arkansas black apple. And it's an heirloom apple that one of the reasons it literally came from Arkansas, and it has the color of a plum and a really dense flesh. One of the reasons that it was grown was because it keeps in a root cellar for a disturbingly long period of time with no degradation in quality. So literally, I mean, you could buy Arkansas blacks and stick them in a cupboard where it's nice, dark, and cool, and they will keep a really long time, like potatoes, right? Potatoes keep forever with no real nutritional deficiencies. And the problem is that the Arkansas blacks have not been created like Red Delicious apples and all that, and so they're not as easily managed commercially. So there's a profit disincentive. So if I really wanted people to have apples and do it in a really sustainable way, I would find ways to get Arkansas black apples growing locally because they'll keep so long during the seasons.
Wow, that's fascinating. And I think one of the things, just as a consumer, I try to do this as much as I can, is support our local farmers by going to the local markets, even though, sometimes it's a pain because I'm like, I've already been to the grocery store. It's a separate trip, to go to the farmer's market. But I try to make it a fun thing because I want that good local produce. And the only way that those guys are going to stay in business is if the people that can afford it do keep buying from them.
Right. And the real challenge in this, and this is that public health space that I obviously, you can tell I care a great deal about, is public health talks about the ecological model. And what that means is the individual can only do so much, and it's dependent on the ecology within which they spend their time. So you can't ask people to eat healthy if the systems don't support eating healthy, because some people will pull that off, but they're a very, very small percentage. So we have to think about the ecology, the systems, the policies, the practices that enable the things we want, rather than and of course now we're into big ag and all that sort of stuff. And again, I'm not going to slander them, because they've brought food to all kinds of places, and hunger's so terrible that, at least not being hungry has some big advantages. But our systems don't support what we would like to have, Catherine, and the result is that we can't get people to change their behavior because the system doesn't support it.
Well, maybe I'm looking at it from the perspective of a teacher, but it still seems to me like education is an important piece of this, because, like even in these food deserts, if the people there were really educated about the benefits of making that investment, one way that we look at it is, instead of paying a bunch of medical bills later, we're investing in more expensive, better quality food now. So it's like we're making our investment up front, which is, saving us a lot of health issues later, which is going to save the money on the back end. And, it seems like even with, like you mentioned, you were in a co-op, and we've been part of a food co-op at different times, because even in those food deserts, it seems like, if the people were really well educated, they knew the value and the need of this, they could get co-ops to come in and make drops in those areas, and work together as a community to grow more community gardens. I know Detroit has tons of vacant lots, and there's a lot of people there working to create these community gardens in these vacant spaces.
Yeah, and I've been reading some about what's going on in Detroit, and I mean it's a brilliant model. I mean, the basic model is, let's use this low cost land, let's get the produce here, and then education works. But if the produce isn't there, it literally, if you have to take your spare dollars and get on a bus and ride for 40 minutes to find quality food, the odds are really good you're going to buy some low quality food from the convenience store, because it's too hard. 40 minutes one way, packing bags back, 40 minutes back. That's the kind of systemic stuff that we have to think about. And regrettably, in our country, as much as I believe in individual initiative, we're only as good as the system that supports us. We are interdependent. And so I can't ask people to make large changes if the system literally works against them making those changes. It's like suggesting to people in a buffet-driven world to not eat too much, right? I mean, we already know that doesn't work, right? I mean, we humans, we are prone to overeating. We've evolved that way, apparently. So if you send thousands of us down these massive lines with huge amounts of food, we're probably going to eat too much.
Although with the backlash, I think McDonald's did discontinue their supersize program, right? So there's some progress, right? Getting people thinking about that more. But yeah, the buffets are still a killer.
Oh man, and it's just,
yeah.
I mean, again, we have to
I just remember this one show. It was like the guy said, just because it says all you can eat doesn't mean that you have to eat all you can eat.
Well, but again, now that we know, so here's again, public health. The difference between the individual versus the population. I can take any one individual and send them down a buffet line, and they may be successful. But what the data shows is, if I send 100,000 people down buffet lines, a whole bunch of them will fail to manage their food intake. They just will. So we can't just isolate this to, well, just everybody needs to be a better human being, because the systems have to support the things that we have found to be advantageous. And now, Patrick, I mean, you're working against the commercial systems and the big growers and the big economic systems and the huge subsidies that are available to large agribusinesses. And man, that is a tough systems problem to solve.
Yeah.
Well, I was amazed by a film. I'm not sure if you saw it, Ron. It's called The Biggest Little Farm.
That rings a bell, but I don't think I saw it. What was the gist?
Well, it's a beautiful documentary about a couple that purchases this farm, pretty much a wasteland farm in California. And
oh, that's right. Yeah, okay.
they turn it into this biodiverse, amazing organic farm. And they're saying, that's what the way farming used to be. It's like you have to have the biodiversity, different animals, different crops, and everything together, and they're able to do it organically. And so after I saw that movie, I said, this is how we transform the food system in the world, is we have these little biodynamic farms scattered all throughout the United States. And boy, that would take the food out of the hands of big ag and pesticides and back to the hands of little farmers, which is a dream of mine, but we'll see.
Well, and if we go into big systems thinking around that, the questions I begin to ask are, what are the incentives and disincentives to have people do that?
Right.
Because if the resource base is being driven to big food producers, and there's a place for that, I don't want to slam anybody, but if the systems don't support what they did, it makes it much harder for anybody to go do that. So I guess I should like put a dot on that and say that's the public health space that interests me the most, is how do we create systems and policies and practices and an ecology, an environment in which what public health people would say is so that we make healthy choices easy choices rather than hard choices. Because if it's an easy choice, people will do it. They just will, because it's easy.
Well, speaking of little farms, we're almost out of time here, but I do want to touch real quick on the goat Wonder.
Yeah.
My name is Wonder, who is on a spiritual quest with his spirit guide, Mac Crack Cow.
Mac Crack Crow. It's a crow.
Oh, crow.
Yeah.
I misread that. Yes.
Yeah.
Mac
Crack
Crow.
I'll give you I'm on a writing vacation as we record this, and I was on a writing vacation to Victoria, British Columbia, some years ago, and I was out taking a walk with my urban walkabout, and I ended up in a park there that had a petting zoo with goats, and I was all by myself. It was this beautiful, glorious day, and I'm hanging out, communing with the goats. I got a thing for goats. I don't know what that's about. And all of a sudden, a murderer, that's a flock of crows, showed up and just started raising hell. And it was a transcendent moment. I filled up just talking about it. And I was there for 30 minutes, and then I went walking, and I'm walking, a mile from where I was, and all of a sudden that story downloads out of the ether. It comes from nowhere. The muses bestowed it upon me. So I stopped in a coffee shop and I hammered out an outline for it. And it's the story of a goat named Wonder, who's on this quest, a soul-driven quest, and he acquires a spirit guide, Mac Crack Crow, and he has a teacher, an older goat named Oren. And it's his quest across a Western landscape to find, I guess, what we might call enlightenment, although he would never say that. And he's called on a quest, and it's probably my favorite story.
Awesome. Well, I can relate to those downloads. Definitely. I think just about any writer can. But we are out of time. And so one more time, how can people reach you?
Well, core information on me is at ronaldchapman.com. You can find a lot of my content at seeingtrue.com, where I just put a lot of free material out. And I just want to thank you all for reaching out to me. This has been a delightful conversation, and I think we should get together again and talk about food systems some more.
Oh, definitely. We'd love to.
I don't think we exhausted that. So thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Well, we love having you too. And thank you all for joining us. And you can connect with us on Facebook at Spirits Journey Radio. Be sure to like our page. And this is Spirits Journey. We are on Truth Frequency Radio, simulcast on Oneness Talk Radio. I'm Patrick.
I'm Catherine. Thanks, y'all. We'll see you next week.
Bye for now.